I'm thinking about our two sons. Now we had to prepare them to live in two worlds. I'm thinking about the frank and emotional conversations my wife and I have had with them just this past week as we discuss the situations that have led to the protests around our country. Finally, I'm thinking about my historic nomination to be the first African American to serve as the Air Force Chief of Staff. I'm thinking about the African Americans that went before me to make this opportunity possible.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. Today on The Path Forward, it's a special pleasure to welcome General Charles Q. Brown, Jr., the new Air Force Chief of Staff, and the first African American who has served as chief of one of our military services. And as you heard in that clip, a brief excerpt from comments he made last August, a person who has spoken out with unusual clarity and conviction about issues of race, the divisions in our country, and also the need for change in our military services. So, General Brown, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure to be with you today.
So I want to start by asking you about the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, an event that seared into the consciousness of the nation. And I want to ask you to begin by telling us what you thought as you looked at those images yourself on that very frightening afternoon.
Well, David, it was a day that I was actually teleworking that day, and so I was actually working, but very much parked in front of the TV. And there's a couple things. One, I was shocked. I was kind of hard to believe it was all happening. And then by the same token, I was very, very disappointed, and it hurt. One of my best friends had sent me a text while all this was going on, and we exchanged a text, and we talked about how much this hurt and how unbelievable it was to see this happen in our nation. So, I think like many Americans, I struggled on that day to understand kind of what was going on and where we were going to go as a nation.
Some of the people who stormed the Capitol were carrying Confederate flags and other insignia that had explicit racist, white supremacist markings. I want to ask you what your feelings were as you saw those symbols of another terrible time in our history.
Well, I'll just tell you, the Confederate flag throughout my career has been one of those things where it's never really set well with me. Just watching, around our force or other locations, and having been stationed in locations in the South where you saw it prominently, but to see it up on the Capitol and to be walked through the Capitol gives me an indication that where we are as a nation and where there is a bit of division, and how we need to come together and get past our differences, because that's what's made us great as a nation. But I just tell you, it was one of those where when you saw that, you actually gives you a sense of how some people really feel as well. And the fact that we need to work together better to be the nation we've all grown to know and love, and how we come together and work together a bit better and work past our differences for no matter who you are.
One more question, General Brown, about January 6th. In the aftermath, there were some commentators, some prominent political leaders, who said that they thought that the reaction by the Capitol Police and by police, law enforcement, the National Guard, was conditioned, in part by the fact that the protesters were mostly white, that if this had been a Black Lives Matter protest, as last summer, you would have seen a much harsher response. Do you think that issue of racial disparity in treatment is a factor here?
I think it's something that needs to be considered, but I also think it's a pendulum. You take a look at and I was not in Washington, D.C. In the summer when the protests happened here in D.C., but there was a pendulum swing of the reaction then, and I think in this case the pendulum swung a different direction, and probably was not the amount of capability or the underestimation of the passion of those that came to the Capitol that day. And so there is maybe, and I have seen that in the press, and it does make you wonder how we reacted as a nation to these particular events on the 6th, and how I think in some cases we underestimated the reaction from those that participated on the 6th.
There was a very strong reaction from Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, you and the other chiefs in a message to the troops that you released on January 12th, almost a week after these events. And it was a pretty stern warning to the troops that not only were these actions a violation of the Constitution, of our values as Americans, but they were illegal. And I read that as a warning and an expression of concern by the chiefs about extremism within the military and among veterans. It's now clear, the count I had in the newspaper was at least 30 of the people who were involved in those militant protests were either serving National Guard, active duty, or veterans. Just talk for a minute about your concern about the spread of these extremist ideas within the military community.
Well, David, the first thing I go back to the signing of the memo by the Joint Chiefs and the aspect of the facts associated with all of us that rose our right hand to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And you may have differences of opinions amongst, from a political standpoint, but we still have a job to do to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so for me, that was I felt pretty strongly about that. I think all the, I can't speak for all the Joint Chiefs, but just based on the mood when we sat down to do this, I felt we were all in the same place. It also, I also think about the aspect of, we can talk about extremism, but one of the things I've talked about as I've come into this job is I want to create an environment where all of our airmen can reach their full potential. And extremism is not one of those that allows that to happen, whether it be sexual assault, discrimination. There's so many factors that can actually detract from our airmen and our service members reaching their full potential. And extremism is one of those, and that's actually come to fore based on the events of the 6th. I also look at racial disparity that came to fore over the course of the summer, and sexual assault is something that we are dealing with, and we have to do better in those areas to create that right environment. It requires leadership from my level, but from all levels across the force.
So let me ask you the tough question, which is, how do you go after this extremist sentiment that's out there in the military? It's out there in American life. Without violating people's First Amendment rights and without making the problem worse, without driving people into even more extreme, secretive behavior. I'm sure you've thought carefully about how to do that within the Air Force. What are your thoughts? How do you go after it without driving it underground?
Well, part of this is actually we lay out what our standards are and what our expectations are for those to be part of our force. And we hold ourselves to a higher standard. And just like, a number of Americans, depending on whatever career field, you have certain standards you live up to. And that's the aspect that we have to talk about, our core values and our standards. But we need to be open and transparent about how we talk about those. And I think that's actually something I've seen over the course of the summer based on race. I think the same thing has to apply where you have a different view, and to get some of those maybe those views on the table. The one other thing I would share with you, David, is that for many of our airmen, our service members, when they come into the military, this may be the most diverse organization or experience they've ever had. And I think about those that grew up in the inner city or grew up on a farm someplace where you don't cross paths with different, race, gender, ethnic background, and so that becomes a challenge. And how do we then bring our service members in and assimilate them into something that's bigger than themselves, and to get past maybe some of the things they grew up with, and that's that doesn't happen overnight, but it's going to take time and effort and leadership to make all that come together.
We had a historic event with the confirmation of General Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense by the Senate, first African American to serve as Secretary of Defense. I'm sure you've known him. Give our viewers a sense of what you expect to see from him as Secretary of Defense, and also about your conversations with him.
Well, I have served with him, and when I was at United States Central Command as one of the air component commander, and I've always been impressed with his leadership, and he's pretty straightforward. He's very thoughtful, and from that aspect, and he's inclusive, and from all those, that's what I expect to see from him as the Secretary of Defense. And naturally, he has vast experience within the Department of Defense, but it's also the experience in the work he's done over the years, but also the relationships he's built as well. And whether it's with me, but other members of the department, but also those on the civilian side, that I think he'll be pretty straightforward as far as how we move out. He's pretty direct on what he expects, and I think he's going to hold us to account as well to ensure that we deliver on the things that his priorities, the president's priorities, to do the things that the Department of Defense does to secure our national security. But also how we work with our allies and partners, and also have the right environment within the force.
Let me turn to something that's more personal, which our viewers had a chance to see in the introduction to this program, and that's the remarkable video statement that you made last August when the country was still struggling with the aftermath of George Floyd's death, the Black Lives Matters protests, the passion for racial justice around the country, and the difficulty in the streets. You made that unusual video. What I'm thinking about, and I want to ask you what led you to do that, and what effect you think that had both on the Air Force and on our discussion nationally about race.
Well, David, it was, I really debated. This is, actually the video was done in June. And I was I'd already testified for my confirmation, but I was waiting for confirmation to be the next Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And at the same time, I did not want to step on the toes of General Goldfein, my predecessor. But at the same time, I had airmen that were warning what I was thinking about. And as a matter of fact, it was a Facebook post that I saw that, my staff, someone had actually come back and said, hey, he's waiting for confirmation, so he's probably going to be quiet about it. And I was, and so I debated about it. But we had a conversation with one of our sons. And our youngest son was a freshman at Washington University in St. Louis when the events at Ferguson happened, in Ferguson, Missouri. And so he lives here in Washington, D.C., and he had called us, and I was, living in Hawaii, and he was really struggling with the events. And so he asked me, Dad, what is PACAF going to say? Pacific Air Force is going to say. And really what he's asking me was, Dad, what are you going to say? And so I was kind of on the fence because I really wanted to say something, but I was also kind of waiting for confirmation. So confirmation I was told was going to happen on Tuesday. It didn't happen on that Tuesday. And finally I said, okay, I'm just going to do it. And so I decided to do the video. And partly it was really more directed to the airmen in Pacific Air Forces. I had no intention for it to go as broadly as it did. But in hindsight, I'm glad it did. Because it's many of the things that I've dealt with, what our sons have dealt with, and many others that look like me have dealt with, not just African Americans, but you can talk about any diverse group within our country that has dealt with a level of either discrimination or disparity. From that aspect, I've never been afraid to speak up, and as I far exceed any place I ever planned to be, but I always wanted to say what's on my heart, and that's what I did.
I'd urge our viewers to go and take a look at this remarkable statement if you haven't seen it by General Brown. What I'm thinking about, it's on Facebook. I'm just going to quote a brief passage. You said you were full of emotion, not just for George Floyd, but for the many African Americans who suffered the same fate as George Floyd. You talked about the difficulty you'd experienced living in two worlds as an African American and as an Air Force fighter pilot. Remarkable statement. So I want to ask you the question in a way that your son asked you back then, which is now that you're Air Force Chief of Staff, what are you thinking about? What's on your mind now when you think about issues of racial justice?
Well, David, I think the one thing that out of the course of the summer and the events over the summer, this has actually opened up the conversation that, was on a lot of minds of particularly African Americans, where we're able to talk more openly. And from that aspect, I think that's good. By the same token, our airmen got a voice. Our airmen got the chance to speak up of what they were feeling. At the same time, it opened up the aperture for those who don't walk in our shoes, and across the different levels of leadership to actually open their eyes a bit more. I had, some of my mentors that who had mentored me had no idea, after seeing the video, had really no idea the things that were on my mind or things I was dealing with. And so from that aspect, that actually has opened up a little more frank conversation about race and diversity within the force. And so I really see it as an opportunity. And the thing I am really focused on and thinking about is to ensure that we do something that is meaningful, that's sustainable, and that endures well after me. And those are the things I want to make sure we put into our force. That it doesn't become personality dependent, leadership dependent, but it's something that becomes part of the culture of our force, of the Air Force going forward. And so those are the things I'm thinking about. And we're making some decent progress there, but there is a lot of work to be done in this area to continue to make us create that right environment that I spoke of earlier.
I want to ask you about two specific areas of racial disparity before we talk about some other issues facing the Air Force. But for you and Secretary Austin, and for all the chiefs, the numbers are disturbing. I just was looking at a compilation that was prepared over the weekend by PBS that said Black service members are 16% of the military force, but only 8% of the officers. White service members are 55% of the military, but 72% of the officers. Those numbers are so striking. So when you think about changing them, how are you going to do that in a way that is reflected through the military, through the Air Force, as you look at promotion panels? What's the way to deal with that problem in a way that strengthens the Air Force and the military?
Yeah, David, I did see that PBS report, and there is some accuracy. I mean, there is accuracy to that report, and that's just one of the things we found in our review that we did over the course of the summer. The way we address this is by purposeful management and leadership. And there's a couple things we've already done inside the Air Force, and that's particularly on the officer side, is we broke up our promotion boards to actually do developmental categories. So it wasn't, kind of about a big one-size-fits-all by and large, and that gives us a little better chance to work some of the talent management aspects. The other things that we have to do is ensure that we have diversity on the boards, but also diversity on the candidate list, and that's something we have been doing, but I don't know that we've been doing as purposeful as we probably could, and as purposeful as we plan to do. And so, the aspect, particularly when you have, build a big foundation. So it's, we're a very hierarchical organization, so you need to have a big foundation coming in at the entry level, and then you got to sustain that over time to ensure that you have individuals of diverse backgrounds available as you get to more senior ranks. And so that's one thing we're focused on, to ensure we understand why people stay, why people leave, but also as we look at our different lists and different panels of boards, we actually ensure that we have diverse candidates on the list. And the last thing I would say on that is how we encourage and mentor some of those diverse candidates, because sometimes they may feel like they're not qualified and not put their name in. And we've got to actually nudge and pull and actually purposely manage to ensure that we have diverse candidates that can compete. And if they need some help in certain areas with coaching or additional training or additional opportunities, that is something we've got to continue to work on as well. So it's really about providing those opportunities and the mentorship and the nurturing to ensure that all of our service members have the opportunity to compete on a level playing field.
Final question, General Brown, in this area. On December 23rd, you issued a directive to conduct a comprehensive review of official and unofficial unit emblems, morale patches, mottos, nicknames, coins, all that other sort of descriptive that the Air Force has to ensure that these were helping produce an inclusive and professional environment. What concerns you that led you to issue that directive? Did you find that some of those nicknames, mottos, whatever, had a negative and derogatory effect?
Well, actually, I'll tell you, David, I've seen this kind of, particularly in leadership over the course of my career. I'd say probably the back half of the career, where there's things that we've had put in place, whether it's a patch, coin, a motto that may have been okay or been accepted in the past. But over time, as you start to open the aperture and start talking about disparity and being more inclusive, you can't eliminate different parts of the organization or the Air Force if we're not conscious of it. And this goes into kind of the unconscious bias. And so from that aspect, it was an opportunity for us to take a hard look at some of these areas that we really haven't looked at in the past. And really, it may have bothered somebody, but it felt like nothing was going to be done about it. And so in this case, it's an opportunity for us to take a look at it and actually do a hard review for ourselves, and then take the appropriate action to whether we continue with whether the patch, the motto, the coin, or is it something that needs to be changed to be more inclusive of the force. And so that's what drove this review.
So you have a world of challenges now as the Air Force Chief of Staff. Your service in some ways is the most technologically complicated and advanced. I want to ask you about your modernization agenda. You promulgated a new strategy paper in August, as I understand it, that was called Accelerate, Change, or Lose. And I just want to ask you to unpack that for us. What does the Air Force need to do to change more quickly? What does it need to begin to try to break with in doctrine, in strategy, in weapons acquisition? What's your agenda?
Well, David, I wrote that for a couple of reasons, and part of that was because I spent my time as a general officer not in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, and was mostly in joint jobs. And because I was in joint jobs, I actually could watch the Air Force from the outside to an extent. And from that aspect, I could actually take a hard look at our service. And I just felt that in some cases that we were not moving fast enough to deliver capability out to the warfighter in the field. And I just felt there were some bureaucratic processes, and then how we do our acquisition, and not, in some cases, not being threat mindful as we go forward. And as the threat changes and watching how some of our adversaries change quickly, we were still on the same path and don't deviate from. And I felt like if we didn't start changing that approach and start taking advantage of some of the acquisition authorities that we have, changing the culture of being able to make decisions and making tough decisions, then I felt like we're going to lose. And that's why I laid that out. And so we've got to really take a hard look internal to the Air Force to be able to make some of the tough calls. But at the same time, it's how we better collaborate with those here in the Department of Defense, how we collaborate with members on the Hill, and how we collaborate with industry. Because our national security, we're all in this together from a national security standpoint. And I think that's where I felt like we need to actually be a little more open and transparent as an Air Force. Talk about what it is we need to do, highlight where the problems are, and be able to think about where we need to be in the future, and then how do we work from where we are today to get to the future, and do that collaboratively with those key stakeholders.
One challenge for the Air Force, some people would say a headache, to be honest, is the creation of a Space Force. This was a pet project of President Trump's. It's something in the end that the chiefs ended up supporting, but there was concern in the Air Force, often expressed to me. What's your own judgment as Air Force Chief of Staff? Do you think that we should revisit this decision and ask some more questions about it, or is this a done deal and we're just we just need to move forward with the Space Force and that's it?
I think we got to move forward. And I'll say that for a couple of reasons. When I was out in the Pacific Air Forces, when the deliberations were ongoing, the one thing that it did do, the debate about Space Force, from my perspective back then, wherever it was going to land, it actually increased the discussion on space, the importance of space, and why we need to defend in space. And so with the decision already being made and the Space Force stood up, there are some opportunities here to actually increase our visibility on space. Also, I think the side benefit, and that's kind of why I wrote Accelerate, Change, or Lose, is because the Space Force is coming out of the Air Force. It's given us an opportunity to take a hard look at ourselves as an Air Force. And there's some things that we could do differently and better. And there's some things we may be able to learn as we look at a separate service now that starts from scratch. And we have to work together because we're in the same department with the same secretary. And so there's some things we can learn as well from the Air Force. But I just, we are all dependent on space. And, even to do what we're doing right now is dependent on space. You think about our smartphones, all that stuff is dependent on space. And if we're not thinking about it and just take it for granted, we don't want to be in a position where we lose our capability in space. And so there are some positive things about the stand-up of the Space Force, and I think we need to continue to move forward with the effort.
New York Times this morning had a powerful piece about the challenge to the United States in space, especially from China, making the very point that you did about our dependence on vulnerability on space-based assets to project power. Let me ask you to speak a little bit about the challenge from China. I'll say the threat from China to our military capabilities, both in space and in the domains that you oversee as Air Force Chief of Staff. Tell me what worries you about China, what worries you about our ability to project power against China, and what you want to do about it.
Well, the thing I worry about, David, is you just think about what's happened over the course of the past 30 years. We're right now in the midst of celebrating the 30th anniversary of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And we as an Air Force have been in conflict in the Middle East for the past 30 years. And during that time frame, the People's Republic of China has actually been able to watch how we operate and has not been engaged in conflicts. So they've been able to, in some cases, accelerate their own development of their capabilities. And having spent the past 2 years in the Pacific and really, and having spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East, but then going to the Pacific, what I was able to see is how quickly they were actually developing their capabilities. And that to me gives me pause to really think about it. But also, as I spent time talking to our allies and partners in the region, what they were seeing over time and the influence that China was trying to wield within the region. And so that becomes a concern because it upsets the kind of rules-based international order that has actually kept the world in a security pretty stable over the course of the past 70 years. Despite some conflicts, but by and large, it's been the kind of the format we've operated under since World War II. And so from that aspect, that concerns me, the fact that they are actually driving influence and actually increasing their capability. Which puts pressure on our allies and partners, puts pressure on us, but also puts pressure on our economy because our economies are fairly well intertwined. And so we've got to put in a position where not just with the Air Force, but with the other services and their capabilities, but also throughout the whole of government and the interagency, how we pay attention to the objectives China has and fully understand where they're trying to head and the influence that they have within the region, but also the influence they're starting to wield around the world. And it's there's places where we can compete, but I think there's also places we can cooperate as well.
So in the minute that we have left, let me just ask you for just a quick answer to a very complicated question. Of all the technological changes that are coming, I think of hypersonics, I think of lasers, I think of sophisticated drones. What do you think is the biggest game changer for the Air Force that's coming along that you're going to really try to focus on?
David, I would say it's the digital trinity and aspect of being able to do digital engineering, open mission system with software, and agile software development. The ability to actually, it's not so much what we build, it's how we build it faster. And so when you're able to use a digital engineering concept, we did that with the T-7. The next generation air dominance demonstrator that flew last year was also done using digital technology, open mission systems, agile software. That capability, that would gives you the opportunity to go faster. And that's why when I talk about accelerate, change, or lose, having that mindset allows us to do that across the force, not only for the Air Force, the Space Force is able to do some of this as well. and you're able to use the digital aspect of capability to, design electronically in a digital form before you start even bending metal, and that way you can deliver a capability much faster.
So I want to thank, on behalf of all of our viewers, General Charles Brown, for an unusual conversation. It's rare to have a chance to talk in a way that's personal and direct with senior officers of the military. General Brown, we're really grateful that you could join us today. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure. Wish we had a little more time, but good seeing you, and look forward to crossing paths with you again.
We'll have you back soon. So I'll be back tomorrow for a conversation with Ray Dalio, who's one of the biggest thinkers on economic issues around. And at 12 noon on Wednesday, my colleague Francis Steed Sellers will be talking with Melinda and Bill Gates in two rare back-to-back interviews. So make sure to join us for those. Thanks for joining us on Washington Post Live.